So first, part of the benefit of just continuous monitoring is that every training session can be a data collection session. So one of the things that we've seen is there's a lot of instances where the recovery of your cardiovascular system is uncoupled. See that uncoupling between muscles, which is kind of an interesting component, could help you tweak form, but even better understanding trying to do low intensity aerobic work. Oftentimes you'll see with the CrossFitter, they might be at 110 or 120.
Could you maybe explain maybe some of the reasons why you think that CrossFit athletes per se don't have the highest VO2 max, although they... All right, Evan, thank you for being here. Let's jump right into it. So you're a physiologist who have been working with a lot of elite athletes, and you also have a super interesting background of, like bioenergetics and also computational modeling. I think not so long ago you started a company called NOXX, and you are actually building or developing a wearable that is kind of an upgrade of NIRS. How to say it, right? We already talked quite a bit about NIRS on our channel and also, how to use it. But could you explain a little bit where the upgrade is and how you could use your device?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the NOXX wearable. It's a small, roughly thumb-sized device. So what makes the NOXX wearable unique among other muscle oximeters is that the NOXX wearable is the first device to measure both muscle oxygenation, nitric oxide levels, and then movement acceleration in real time.
Okay.
So the way that I think about this device, it has a lot of different sensors jam-packed in. It's kind of like a little lab in a small thumb-sized device, and this allows you to collect and analyze data essentially anywhere you want during any activity.
Yeah. So it's the accelerometer and obviously the NO measurements. Could you explain this a little bit? So why is NO interesting to measure? And maybe as a second question, how do you exactly measure this technically?
Yeah, so first, why the NO is interesting to measure. So I think in the fitness industry, at large, we tend to have some preconceived notions about nitric oxide. Generally, when people are thinking about nitric oxide, they're thinking about things like beetroot supplements and No Explode, if anyone's ever used some of those older products. And really, that is a form of nitric oxide that's released from the endothelial cells. It's a little bit different than what NOXX is measuring. So to think of how that system would work, if I were to clamp down on my forearm right now and just cut off my blood flow, and then I release, when that blood all rushes back into the large blood vessels, it's going to push against the walls of the vasculature, and it's going to stimulate the endothelial cells to release nitric oxide.
Okay.
That form of nitric oxide is short lasting in blood, milliseconds. And what that's primarily going to do is dilate large blood vessels and arteries, and that's going to be beneficial for lowering blood pressure. But that is not going to oxygenate these small blood vessels in muscle tissue or brain or heart. So the form of nitric oxide that NOXX is measuring, the technical name for it is SNO hemoglobin or S-nitrosohemoglobin. It's a form of nitric oxide that actually rides on the red blood cell, and it's released in small blood vessels in response to deoxygenation. So what we're specifically measuring is that form of NO that's responsible for increasing blood flow and oxygen delivery to muscle tissue. The reason why this becomes so important is that when we're using tools like NIRS to measure muscle oxygenation and we see someone exerting themselves and deoxygenating their muscle tissue, the component that we are always missing is knowing, well, what's happening to their blood flow? Are they deoxygenating because they can't increase blood flow to the tissue, or are they deoxygenating because that oxygen utilization is superseding supply because the intensity is so high? So having that nitric oxide measurement allows you to peel back those additional layers and better understand how the body is responding to different physiologic stressors like exercise or altitude. There's a lot of different things that could be impacting the muscle tissue.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So maybe just a little backstory. Last week we had a lab meeting with my professor, Katrien de Bock, and she's also really into vasculature and endothelial cells. And we were talking about if you have a mouse, right, and you would block the vascularization because of exercise, you would train them for, let's say, 8 weeks, but you have a certain model where you block the new vascularization. Then we wanted to know if the adaptations to exercises would still be there. Would the mice still be able to run faster and longer after these 8 weeks? And we were able to actually block these neovascularization, but we still saw the increase in exercise capacity. So I was like, okay, this is interesting. Maybe it's just purely, let's say, the perfusion that is still intact. Maybe you don't have the amount of new blood vessels, but maybe they have a better capacity to perfuse or to release nitric oxide. And we don't have the answer, obviously, because we don't know this. Maybe, it's quite an interesting idea.
Really interesting research. So the amino acid that our snow hemoglobin, the form of NO that we measure, attaches to is called the beta cysteine 93 amino acid site, and it's conserved in all mammal species. So whether you're a humpback whale or a rat or a human being, we all have that same amino acid sequence. There's some really interesting research. It's in mice out of Jonathan Stamler's lab, who's actually an advisor for NOXX. He's worked with us a lot on developing these nitric oxide measurements. So they have C93 knock-in mice that they can't carry nitric oxide on that amino acid site. The thing that kind of blew my mind when I first started working with him and kind of parsing through the data is that these C93 knock-in mice, they have totally normal oxygenation levels. So if you look in the muscle tissue, the brain, the heart, oxygen levels look totally fine, but they suffer from hypoxic and ischemic conditions. And that's because the nitric oxide is what actually helps the oxygen detach from the hemoglobin to diffuse into the cell. So a mouse without this form of nitric oxide has normal oxygen levels, but they cannot actually utilize oxygen. So there's some really interesting data. They published a paper, I think, in 2021 in PNAS, looking at these mouse models showing that the knock-in mice can't reoxygenate tissues after an ischemic stimulus. They also tend to develop like ischemic heart attacks after exercise, even though their oxygen levels are normal. So there's a lot of really interesting research going on in this area.
Yeah, completely understand this. So I told her already that we were maybe missing the whole picture by just looking at the neovascularization, which indeed is an interesting concept of exercise or adaptation, but maybe there's many other things where we're not looking at. So that's maybe I want to ask you this question. Maybe a question, could you pull up some, let's say, a case study from an athlete you have been working with where you could show that, for example, breathing, just let's say the way of breathing during an interval session could have an effect on NO and SMO2 levels. So the people who were listening and viewing could actually have a more detailed look on how that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is interval exercise session. I'll get into the breathing impact on nitric oxide shortly. First, we could just kind of walk through some of the kind of big picture trends that we're seeing in the data. So first, what this athlete was doing, they did 5 sets on a 100 cal erg bike, and they rested 3 minutes between sets. The first set was at about an 80% intensity. Each set, they would increase their intensity until the last one was about a 90% effort or 9 RPE. So off the bat, a lot of times I like to just look at the accelerometer data that we're collecting with the device just to kind of understand the landscape of what we're looking at here. So if we toggle everything off except acceleration, we could see these 5 distinct work bouts here. And then this was a little bit of a cooldown. We have these 5 work bouts with a rest period in between, and that's where the accelerometer measurement is getting zeroed out. Now, what I like to do after that is I'll toggle on the muscle oxygenation measurement. So the way that you could think about muscle oxygenation is that it represents the dynamic balance of oxygen supply and utilization in muscle tissue. If muscle oxygenation is decreasing, oxygen demand is greater than supply. If it's increasing, supply is greater than demand. And if it's unchanging, those are roughly in balance with one another. So off the bat, one of the things we see even on this first work set, if we kind of zoom in here at an 80% effort, is when this athlete starts exerting themselves, we have this immediate drop in muscle oxygenation, and that tells us that their oxygen demand is superseding the supply. But if we zoom out, it's a little bit easier to see. We could start that muscle oxygenation actually starts increasing across the work set. What that's telling us is that this athlete is getting a different physiologic response now, where before that intensity was enough to deoxygenate their muscle tissue, now their supply systems have kicked in. And, you know, this could just be because they're better warmed up. It could be that they're coordinating their breathing better. A lot of times you'll see this very early into workouts. Now, if we juxtapose this against, let's say, the second set where the intensity is a little bit higher, we see this, you know, very rapid drop initially, and then this progressive decline in muscle oxygenation. This tells us the athlete is continuing to use a greater and greater percent of their oxygen supply to power their activity. And this is a normal response to high intensity exercise. I'm not going to go through each individual set here, but you could see that the delta between their baseline oxygenation and their finishing oxygenation starts to expand more and more each set. And again, this is exactly what we'd expect. It's increasing intensity, so we're eliciting a greater physiologic response each set. Now, where this starts to get a little bit more interesting is when we toggle on the nitric oxide measurement, because a lot of times we'll see this type of muscle oxygenation response with this type of interval structure, but the nitric oxide response is way more variable than what you see with the muscle oxygenation. And at first, it could be a little bit confusing because you could have two athletes do the exact same workout, have the same muscle oxygenation response, and you could see very variable nitric oxide responses. So let's just start with the first set because this makes it nice and easy. This athlete starts to deoxygenate their tissue, and you see that nitric oxide increasing. Well, this is a autoregulation of blood flow. When you deoxygenate a muscle tissue, there's a compensatory mechanism where you want to increase blood flow to that tissue. You're matching oxygen supply to oxygen demand, and you could see as the oxygen level increases, the nitric oxide level goes down. It's essentially saying you don't need to keep increasing your blood flow to your tissue. You're doing fine, so we're all good here. We can lower that, not have to stress the body. Now, shortly after, this is where it gets a little bit confusing because you don't see this response in everyone. We see during this rest period, this big burst in NO. That's the reactive hyperemic response. So while this athlete is exercising, and this is a, very muscular, strong CrossFit athlete,
Okay.
he was a former Olympic caliber sprint swimmer, super strong guy. When he stops exercising, he sees this huge nitric oxide burst. And what that's telling us is he's compressing his blood vessels during exercise and restricting his blood flow. So when he releases, he gets all this blood flowing back into the muscle. He even told me during these rest periods, he was feeling his quads so pumped from all the blood rushing in. Keep in mind, I almost never see this response on myself. I have an endurance sport background, not a giant guy. I do not see this reactive hyperemic response unless I'm doing maximal effort squats. This was an erg bike. So this is where we do see these person to person physiologic differences, especially in CrossFit, where you have such a wide array of physiologies at the elite level. If you go to work with elite 5K runners, they're all pretty much the same,
Exactly.
physiologic limitations. Definitely not the case in CrossFit. You guys actually had a really great post on that because a few weeks ago where you're talking about lightweight versus heavyweight CrossFit athletes. So it kind of ties into that. And then each set, essentially, we see this very variable nitric oxide level during the exercise intervals. So to me, when I first looked at this data set, I was like, man, what is going on here? He's increasing his NO level, then decreasing it. I was starting to think, ooh, is this a sign of a cardiovascular limitation? But then when I talked to this athlete, he was telling me, he goes, oh no, I was just playing around different breath manipulation strategies during my workout.
Okay.
Intervals where he was getting the highest nitric oxide level when he was exercising is when he was taking these really deep breaths in through his nose and full forced exhales through the mouth and kind of manipulating his frequency as his body needed. The intervals where his NO levels were lower, he's doing more shallow breathing, rapid pace. And this was an early data set. You could see this is September 25th, 2023.
Yep.
Since then, I've had dozens of ultra endurance athletes, elite CrossFitters, Olympic athletes reaching out that have kind of found the same thing. Hey, I found that I could manipulate my nitric oxide levels with breath. We had never really talked about that in the public, but it's something that people find very quickly. Where I've found this to be a lot of benefit myself is using this during rest periods. So a lot of times if I'm doing resistance training, let's say the sensors on my vastus lateralis, the outer quadricep, I'll actually manipulate my breathing between intervals to keep the highest mean nitric oxide level. And when we have athletes do this, we tend to see it's associated with shorter recovery times.
Interesting. Yeah.
Lower subjective exertion. So there's a lot of kind of interesting things in here. This is very narrow snapshot, but that's what's kind of been cool. We have just had a lot of different athletes doing different things that we never really expected, and analyzing the data.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Maybe I can, if you allow me to also share a recent workout I did with an elite athlete. So I'm certainly not an elite athlete, and it was with Jelle Hoste, who's a top 10 games athlete.
Yeah.
And what we did was an EMOM of macho man. So that's 3
Hmm.
power cleans, 3 front squats, and three jerks every minute on the minute for 15 rounds. I did 60 kilos. He did 84 kilos, so even higher weight. And yeah, this is not with the NOXX. This is with a train red device, so pure measurement. And yeah, to exactly to what you say. So he's able. So this is obviously always the deoxygenation
Hmm.
during his exercise period, and then a rest
Hmm.
period, exercise period, and so on. And you can clearly see that he always almost completely
Yeah.
recovers his NIRS, so muscle oxygenation. And if you look at my data, for example, yeah, it's very clear that I go, yeah, here I'm really going down, and my
Yeah.
my recovery is suboptimal, and I'm getting very much tired. And here I was like, yeah, really at the end of I could maybe do one more
Hmm.
minute, but I was completely done, and he was not done. So it would be highly interesting, obviously, to combine this also with NO measurements to see maybe he's more capable in many ways, but certainly also his breathing might have been more optimal than mine. And this is maybe then the extra benefit you can get from a NOXX device, which I think is quite interesting, and again gives you even more insights as a coach and even as an athlete, but I would say mostly as a coach to tailor your intervals and to see. You talk about this as well. Maybe we can discuss this. That you always call the NOXX a kind of an exercise physiology lab in a little device, which I really
Yeah.
like. It's a good analogy, because you obviously don't have this snapshot, right? If I did my master studies and bachelor studies, we did a VO2 max test, which was like one test snapshot. But with this, you have continuous data throughout a very long time. Have you get some practical implications of how people can use, for example, a NOXX or any NIRS device to see their level of progression during their training? Because that I think is a very good applicable
Mhm.
application of your device.
Yeah, that's a really key aspect because I've used a lot of VO2 testing in the past, things like lactate threshold testing. The
Yes.
thing that's always really challenging, it's kind of the same issue if you go to the lab and get blood work, is you're getting a snapshot of any given day, and that one day might not be reflective of your physiologic state. And this is where when I was working at Training Think Tank and we would have athletes, they might come in, once every 6 months, you might see someone and they could improve on different physiologic metrics, but their performance is worse, so their performance improves and they have worse physiologic metrics on that given day. And you're like, what is going on here? And there's a lot of different confounding variables, particularly in our setup where we had athletes maybe traveling in internationally, and that could mess up a lot of things. So first, part of the benefit of just continuous monitoring is that every training session can be a data collection session. So you don't need to specifically like throw an athlete's training plan out the window or have them peak for a test. You just get data every day
Yes.
and see trends long term. So two of the ways that are very simple to just look at changes in physiology and fitness, I would say one would be to just do the exact same workout, same interval duration, intensity, rest periods, everything on 2 separate weeks, and not literally one after the other. That's generally not going to be enough time to adapt. But let's say we have you do a ramp incremental exercise test today, or any type of assessment that's relevant. It could be a CrossFit Metcon. Have you do the exact same workout 4 weeks later. Well, we can look at things like your muscle oxygenation responses on those 2 different days. If on day one, let's say you went on a 5-minute echo bike, 200 watts, 250, 300, 350, and we do that again a few weeks later. And on each of those individual load steps, you are not deoxygenating your muscles as much. Your nitric oxide levels are not increasing as much. That's telling us this isn't creating as much physiologic stress anymore. That's a great sign. Another way to do it would be, we would call it like making the physiology the fixed component and letting you auto-regulate your performance. So for example, if we were to say, we're going to have you do a 20-minute row at a muscle oxygenation level of 30 to 40% and just see how far you could get or what your average wattage is. And if you're able to hold a higher average wattage at a given level of deoxygenation, that's also a sign that your fitness has improved. Now, both of these could be like a little bit of contrived scenarios. We do often do things like that with athletes, and it's a good way to assess changes in physiology and fitness. But there are even just data points that you could pull from training and normal sessions. And if you get enough of them over time, it could be beneficial. So, for example, you could see what is the greatest delta in muscle oxygenation. So, from baseline to peak of exercise, we want to see that differential expanding over time, telling us that athlete could use a greater percentage of their oxygenation reserve. We would also want to see that over time, your peak nitric oxide level is able to get higher and higher. We could look at things like how your muscle oxygenation relates to your acceleration on a given type of interval. So if you're at 12 meters per second squared on an echo bike and your muscle oxygenation is 30%, and we get enough of those data points in the next few weeks, and 6 months later, we see, wow, when you're at 12 meters per second squared, your muscle oxygenation is at 45% now. That tells us that you've gotten fitter. So what I generally do, I work with a lot of sports teams and like individual athletes. Generally just sit down with them. What are you trying to do? What does your training look like? And we figure out the best way to track their improvements, and we figure out kind of what makes sense in their unique scenario.
Yeah, that's super interesting for sure, because you and others are doing work in the space of NIRS was always used as an observational tool. We just observe and then report it mostly in research papers and so on. Interesting, nice. But what can actual everyday people or elite athletes do with it? And that is something now you can actually use it, I think, as you touched upon, to assess your resting intervals, both in interval training, like endurance interval training, but also strength training. Could you maybe touch upon that? So how could you use autoregulation? That's usually how you term this. How could you use this, for example, in a squat session?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a great question. So a lot of times people will use heart rate for this very purpose. So like, let's say you're doing an interval training session. It's a little bit more apparent how this would be used. You're doing 500-meter row repeats. Let's say you're getting up to 170, 180 beats per minute, and you rest until, let's say, you get down to 100 or 110 beats per minute, and that tells you that your cardiovascular system is recovered. One of the things that we've seen is there's a lot of instances where the recovery of your cardiovascular system is uncoupled from the recovery of your muscular system. So you might get your heart rate down very quickly, but it doesn't mean that your muscles are actually recovered. And you see this mismatch a lot in like elite CrossFitters for whatever reason, the unique physiologic makeup. A lot of times these athletes will get their heart rate very low and their muscles will stay hypoxic. So if we were to do a squat training session, it doesn't make a lot of sense to use heart rate as the measure of control, largely because a lot of those increases are driven by blood pressure. So let's say someone's doing a heavy set of squats, they deoxygenate their muscle from, say, 65% down to 20%. Then we might just have them rest until they could get their muscle oxygenation level back up into that baseline range. And what you start to find with athletes over time is they could figure out how to do that most effectively. So they'll figure out, ooh, are there specific postures I could put myself in, or different breathing strategies I could use in sets to either do that quicker or to a greater degree. For some athletes, you find if they sit down, they kind of like have a little bit of a hunched over posture, they are never going to get their muscle oxygenation level back up in a reasonable amount of time. Where other athletes, they do that exact same thing and they could do that quicker. So there's a lot of interperson variability, but it's very easy to look at these things. It's literally, you could just look at a trend line going up and just wait for it to hit the percentage that you want. You could also just look at the percent figure and see, oh, 45%, 50, 55, and start to play around with that. We could, nitric oxide also ties in there as well, but to kind of keep things simple, that's probably the easiest way to do it.
Yeah, that really reminds me of a lot of normal CrossFit classes I attended throughout the years. What always frustrated me and still is the strength session. The rest periods were also always way too short for myself. Yeah. So I was always naturally pretty strong. So I took higher weights and every 2 minutes, 5-6 back squats. That was never enough for me. And I always told him, maybe you should lengthen this a little bit longer, maybe do a shorter WOD or something, because people are just not getting the benefits, because at the later sets they just are completely oxygenated and they cannot actually do their reps properly. And I think there to have some visual cues could be quite useful for even, as I said, not elite athletes but everyday athletes for sure as well, who want to improve their training efficiency in the gym in a very straightforward way.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's a lot of room for that. And then even things like exercise intensity. So a lot of times when we go into workouts, and I'm definitely, I have this tendency as well, is like, you're like, I want to do this many sets with this long of rest periods at this intensity. And there's a desire to have everything being so rigid to the letter. I come from a track and field background, so there's a lot of that. It'd be, today we are doing 25 200-meter repeats at this exact pace with 45 seconds rest in between. If you go 1 second too long or too short, you just messed up the whole workout for today. And there's this assumption that, I mean, two things. One, that the same intensity is going to elicit the same amount of stress on each set, or that the same recovery is going to get you to the same point each set. And we just see that that's blatantly not true. Now, in like a performance setting, there are times where you do want to keep things fixed, knowing that it is going to progressively kind of mess people up. But a lot of times for like high efficiency training, that might not be the case. So this type of tool also allows you to see, well, if I was starting my 200-meter repeats at this time, and now I'm deoxygenating more and more each set, do I slow down my pace? Or if I'm deoxygenating less, wow, maybe I'm warming up, I increase my speed. Maybe you also bump your rest period 10 seconds forward or back. So I think there's a lot of really like tiny changes that you can make to people's training without it being super complex that could actually make a pretty meaningful difference.
I agree completely. Back in the day, or still, people are using a lot of lactate measurements, right? And lactate is an interesting one because you obviously are measuring the, let's say the production as well as the consumption of lactate in the blood, right? And obviously, it also, you don't know which muscle, or you know, but you don't know really which muscle is producing the most lactate and is going to more anaerobic sources. So, for example, do you have some insights on, for example, if you have a rower, a person who's doing a maximal test on the rower, you would take lactate every 2 minutes, incremental test. And do you see any benefits of putting two NOXX or two NIRS sensors, for example, one at the bicep and one at the quad? Do you see actually people deoxygenating faster in one muscle group during, for example, an endurance test compared to what you could see with lactate, where you obviously don't see this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you could do like things like right, left leg comparisons for true between sides, but even looking at different muscle groups, you do see that there's a variable response. It's not like when you're doing a whole body test of endurance that every muscle is being stimulated equally.
Yeah.
This is where you could even see like biomechanic differences. With a rower, you might see, generally good rowers, you're going to see much more deoxygenation in the lower body musculature versus upper body.
Yeah.
A lot of times in CrossFitters, sometimes you do see more like deoxygenation in the biceps where, they're pulling in a more mechanic fashion. So you could see that uncoupling between muscles, which is kind of an interesting component, could help you tweak form, but even better understanding where the athlete is being stressed in their body.
Now, and also how it affects probably also the in the CrossFit athlete, the next movement. I think maybe it could even adapt your style of rowing a little bit if you have pulling exercises right after, or maybe other leg exercises right after.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of the best athletes do that. You see in CrossFit, this is like years back when grid was a thing, you'd see certain athletes like Sam Danster on very heavy deadlifts might shift from like a posterior chain dominant versus like a very quad dominant deadlift style as they fatigue. And elite cyclists, when we've put them through step tests in the past, we see similar things. If we look at like a vastus lateralis versus like a rectus femoris muscle, you might see a trend where, they're deoxygenating the VL progressively, and then as they start to fatigue, all of a sudden you'll see the vastus lateralis oxygenation levels climbing, but you'll see the rectus femoris dropping more, so they're changing their pedaling style to account for local muscle fatigue. Now, if someone is pushing towards their VO2 max, it's probably going to be relatively futile because, you shifted the muscle recruitment pattern, but your whole body is essentially running out of oxygen. But in a CrossFit type scenario, that could often be very advantageous where there is a lot of local muscle fatigue going on, and you may know that the next movement that you're going to do is going to stress certain muscles more than others. So you could start to play with those different recruitment patterns, knowing that you could preserve yourself a little bit better.
Yeah. Obviously, this is the interesting part. Certainly, if you're a coach, you can just easily tweak these things and look at the continuous data on this. You hear a lot of talk nowadays on big podcasts as well on zone 2 training, right? No one really knows what it is, but at least you have to do very low intensity work, and that's good for longevity, for health, and also for whatever other good reasons there are. Tell me, how could an athlete or a person actually use a NIRS monitor to really dial in their zone 2 training? Because it's an intricate relationship, right? Like, how fast do you go too fast? For example, I know CrossFit athletes, likely their intensity has to be very, very low to actually be in the zone 2 and not go higher zone. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So dialing in zone 2 training intensity, it's relatively easy for like a lightweight endurance athlete. You could even just have them do that conversationally. If they could hold a conversational kind of pace or keep a low heart rate, generally they're going to be in zone 2. Not too complicated, but with
Yeah,
CrossFit athletes, that's definitely not the case. And I think this is one of the nuances of having much more large muscular athletes
yeah,
trying to do low intensity aerobic work. Oftentimes you'll see with the CrossFitter, they might be at 110 or 120 beats per minute. They feel like they're doing something very easy, but if you put a NOx sensor on the quadricep, you might see that they're actually progressively deoxygenating their tissue across the workout. So if you're seeing a steady
yeah,
decrease in oxygenation, even if it is a relatively high percent, let's say 65 down
yeah,
to 50, that's telling you that you're imposing more and more stress over the course of the workout. So you are probably not in zone 2. One of the signs that you may be in zone 2 is that you're at a metabolic steady state. So we should expect that the oxygenation level in your tissue should be pretty stable. Oxygen supply and demand are matched. Now, you could be closer to a maximum steady state, which would be the highest intensity that you're stable, or you could be at a low intensity steady state, and there's going to be some variability between the two. But generally, what I would have an athlete do is start at a very low intensity and just see, could you hold SMO2 stable? Could you pick up the pace a little bit and stay there? Generally, I just want to see someone at a steady state. If they feel like they are exerting themselves or their heart rate starts to climb, I'd have them back off the pace. And over time, you could kind of play around with that a little bit, but it makes it much more clear. We've often found where a lot of like larger athletes, they really can't do anything at that zone 2. So they might even need to break it up in a lot of
crazy.
intervals. They need to do like 60, 30-second work bouts at a very low intensity. And they're like, why are you making me do this? It's so easy. I could hold this for an hour. It's because they're creating so much
Yeah,
intramuscular pressure that they're restricting their own blood
yeah,
flow.
yeah.
I think a lot of times in CrossFit
Super
too,
interesting.
a lot of it is the exercise modality. Something like an echo bike does not lend itself very well to doing zone 2 because it's a flywheel. So when you're turning at a very low wattage, there's actually a lot of resistance on the
Yeah,
pedals. So you're more prone to creating this occlusive strategy. Where if you had like a watt bike or even just a road bike that you could mount on an indoor bike trainer, you could spin at a very high cadence with a low intensity, and that's going to be easier to maintain a high oxygenation level. So there's a lot of things like that that you could kind of play around with for person to person, figuring out what is the proper combination of cadence and resistance that allows you to maintain that high oxygenation level in the tissue.
yeah. That's something that people really, they have no clue, right? If they just have to look at their heart rate in the best case. I mean, they certainly when they're more muscular, then there's no way to know this. Do you? I mean, maybe not you or the people you work with. Is actually zone 2 training incorporated into CrossFit training? You use this to increase their metabolic efficiency, or is it just high intensity work and strength work?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say
Or
a
does it
lot.
depend?
Yeah, I'd say it depends a little bit on someone's training background and what their limiters
Yeah,
are. When I'm
yeah,
working with CrossFit athletes, what I'm always trying to understand, I'm going to take two very extreme scenarios just to give the opposite ends of the spectrum. I've worked with people coming from like an elite Ironman triathlete background that they want to get into CrossFit, and we'll look at their metrics. I'm like, wow, they could beat a lot of games athletes on a 2K row, a 10-minute assault bike for max
for
cals, a
sure.
5K run. Like, sweet. And then I'll look at their one rep max snatch, and I'm like, ooh, it's like 65 kilos. So no matter how much we improve their VO2 max, no matter how
I
much zone,
agree.
they're never going to be an elite CrossFitter. They literally cannot pick up the weights required to play the game. On the other end of the spectrum, you might have someone who is let's actually just ignore the person who's just exceptionally strong coming from like powerlifting background. The person I find more interesting is someone whose sport specific capacity is very good. So they're like a bubble level, let's say sanctional level
Yep.
on open workouts, things of that nature. But when you look at things like their VO2 max or their cyclic metrics, you're like, they're really not that good relative to their competitive caliber. So for that athlete, it doesn't matter how many muscle ups they could do unbroken or like how you improve their snatch endurance or the sport specific competencies. They've essentially maxed out their capacity to improve in the sport before you improve in their quote unquote engine. So let's say their VO2 max, their maximum steady state. So for that person, we really need to identify like an energetic limiter and
Yep.
improve over time for them to improve their performance. So when we're talking about zone two, it's very much, well, who is this person? What do they need to improve? But
Yep.
secondary to that, obviously with zone two, there are a lot of metabolic benefits to doing that type of work. But I think a lot of the reasons why you see that having such a substantial impact improving performance in, let's say, like mid-tier to even advanced runners or cyclists is that it's the benefits to mechanical efficiency.
Yep.
So I've talked about this case study before, but I think it's kind of a really beautiful example. Maybe 10 to 15 years ago, Andy Jones did a case study on Paul Radcliffe, one of the best marathoners in the world. And over a 5-year period, her VO2 max decreased and her performance increased year after year. Her engine got smaller, but she became progressively more efficient. So at a given running speed, she was consuming less
That's
oxygen
okay. Yep.
at her VO2 max running at a faster pace. Now, a lot of those types of improvements come from things like zone two and improved efficiency in your sport specific movement patterns. The problem is with CrossFit, you have a lot of sport specific movements. And I think one of the reasons why the best CrossFitters are often the ones that could tolerate the most volume is they're the ones who could actually improve their efficiency. If you think about the amount of foot strikes running that Paula Radcliffe probably did over a 5-year period, running, 100-mile weeks back to back, there's not a single CrossFit athlete who has trained any of their movements, even 10% of
Oh
that.
yeah, for sure.
Zone two, you're like, you end up in a weird scenario because sure, you can do it cyclically. There are some benefits to doing that, but it's not going to give you those same improvements in efficiency for a CrossFitter. But you also can't do your sport specific movements at that low of an intensity for many of them. So it's a very interesting sport in that you need to be extremely creative in how you figure out how to train these different characteristics.
Yeah, also given their background for sure. Maybe of interest, we did together with the University of Basel, we did a study in elites to very, yeah, like top 5% open athletes, and we actually profiled them physiologically. So we did basic tests in the lab and also basic endurance tests in the lab. So VO2 max tests and so on, and a
Yeah.
critical power test. And certainly on the endurance parameters, they had a very moderate VO2 max, to put it lightly. They had a VO2 max, I think, of 55 to 58, even games athletes. I was very surprised by this because I was thinking, as an exercise physiology background, these guys, they must have maybe not an 80, but at least 70 VO2 max.
Yeah.
All of them didn't have this. So I don't think it was some kind of measurement error. This was clearly the case. Maybe you can, and all on the strength parameters. So when we compared pure strength, like vertical jump or leg press, we compared that to top weightlifters. They were actually very close. They were like 5% lower. But if you would compare their endurance parameters to elite cyclists, I'm talking about 35% less, like very much a lot less. Could you maybe explain maybe some of the reasons why you think that CrossFit athletes per se don't have the highest VO2 max, although they have a lot of muscle mass, they have maybe the potential to have a high VO2 max, at least absolutely.
Yeah. So I think there's probably a few issues here. So one, given the demands of the sport of CrossFit, again, because of the strength demands, you have to be able to pick up those weights. If you cannot pick up the weights, you are not going to be competitive.
You need to have the certain threshold of strength, otherwise your endurance doesn't make any difference, correct?
Yeah, and this is where I think over the past 10 years, we've probably seen some decreases in the VO2 maxes of CrossFit Games competitors as the sport is selectively chosen people stronger and stronger. The weights that you need to be able to lift to be a games athlete now are significantly higher than they were 8 or 10 years ago. In doing some physiologic testing, it is my kind of opinion that the average VO2 max has dropped over those years as well.
That's
and I don't think
interesting.
that's coincidental. So when we think of something like VO2 max, yeah, these people have a lot of muscle mass in theory, you would think they should be able to have pretty high VO2 maxes. But I think, given the size of the heart and particularly the size of the lungs, there's going to be a constraint on how much muscle mass you could gain and continue kind of tapping out your VO2 max. If we just think of, let's say, even the size of the trachea, in elite endurance athletes, you're already pushing against the structures in the respiratory system. There's only so much airflow you could get through your trachea before you actually induce damage to it. Your lungs could only expand so much with training. And really, I think looking at some of Jerome Dempsey's work, I think it's compelling to argue that the lungs really are underbuilt for the demands of maximal endurance performance. So for a CrossFit athlete, you're going to be constrained in total airflow, given that VO2 max is body weight is a factor. It's milliliters per kilogram per minute of oxygen. As you get a larger and larger body mass, given that the oxygen supply systems are going to be constrained in how much they could deliver, past a certain body weight, I think you're just going to be limited and you're going to see VO2 max dropping. And I think CrossFitters have almost certainly crossed that threshold. And that's why looking at games athletes 10 years ago, they tended to be smaller, not as strong. So relative to their body mass, they could have much higher VO2 maxes. I think it'd be interesting to look at the absolute liters, milliliters per minute of oxygen to see if those have increased over time, or if that has been relatively stable as body mass.
Just the body weight.
That's dropped the VO2 when you divide it by kilos of body weight. So I think there's some kind of interesting things that we could look into there.
Yeah, long-term studies in CrossFit Games athlete would be obviously very interesting, but likely not so easy feasible. But that's definitely true, because on the other hand, the counter argument to this obviously are like Langlauf. How do you say that in English?
Yeah, like on cross-country skiing.
Cross-country skiers. They are also 85 kilos, right? And they have actually the highest registered VO2 maxes, certainly, absolutely. So potentially, if you have lifelong pure endurance training with nearly no strength, there might be some adaptations beneficial. But once you are doing some kind of strength exercises, that the body kind of, it doesn't really have to decide. But the pathways are just intertwining here, and yeah, it's interesting. Certainly, the case of VO2 max in athletes, in CrossFit athletes, remains kind of a little bit of a mystery. But yeah. Definitely related to muscle mass per se. Can I show you a graph of myself, a test that you also talk a lot about, and where we can maybe dive into a little bit the ways or way of using NIRS to find limitators of exercise or endurance capacity.
Yeah,
which is very interesting and something that you, in my opinion, only can do with NIRS. Just share here quickly. So I did, maybe I can explain quickly the test. So it's a 5-1-5 test. Here you see it, where an athlete does always increasing intensity of intervals of 5 minutes, but these intervals have the same intensity back to back. So this intervals, let's say 125 watts, then I go to 175 watts, and then 225 watts, right? And then the last one, but I failed, would be 275 and so on and so forth. This was on an air bike. No, this was on a Concept 2 bike. And what is interesting about this test is that you also have one rest period, meaning 1 minute of rest after each interval. And that is to understand your reoxygenation very well. And this is a way to assess let's say the limitators, or how an athlete is limited in their endurance capacity. Maybe you can explain this, because it's very clear in my case here, I think, with this graph.
Yeah, so first kind of touching on the concept of limiters. So I use VO2 max as a stand-in for, let's, think of it as a maximal endurance capacity. So it's the maximum capacity of the pulmonary system to uptake oxygen, cardiovascular system to transport that oxygen, and muscular system to utilize that oxygen. It could be more complex than that, but we'll keep it pretty simple. We think of those three systems, which really are intertwined, but one of them could be a rate limiting factor for the others. So if we think of rate limiting factors, it is the step in a process that is limiting the others. So let's say someone has a pulmonary limitation. They cannot uptake oxygen fast enough, and we're training to improve their muscles' ability to utilize oxygen. Their performance isn't going to improve because they still have that rate limiter. So what we're trying to do with these types of tests is, in an ecologically valid way that makes sense for the sport, push someone's physiology to a breaking point to see if we could identify which of those systems is breaking first. And that tells us that we should be training that system. That's going to be the lowest hanging fruit to try and improve their performance. The 5-1-5 step test is just a nice, convenient way to do that. There's a lot of data from athletes in different sports. So that's kind of the first aspect. Now, looking at your data, again, yeah, I agree. There's a very extreme example here, and that's actually my favorite because sometimes you have these very ambiguous cases, and
That's
that's
why I
just,
show you.
yeah,
I've
that's
always,
just not
just as a
fun.
background, I've always been, as I said, not the strength athlete. I've done multiple sports. I've done CrossFit for a long time. But once from the moment I picked up a barbell, I was good at it. Like I could squat
Yeah,
very heavy, deadlift very heavy. But the workouts were very minor for me. I was always in the middle of the pack of the group.
yeah,
While my strength, I was like 50, 60 pounds higher than the second one on the rankings in an
yeah,
average group of people, right?
yeah.
So this is very clearly why maybe you can explain this a bit better than me.
Yeah, yeah. So this is great. So first we'll kind of walk through some of the different measurements. So starting with muscle oxygenation,
Yes.
with the 5-1-5 step test, like you said, every other set you're increasing your intensity. So we could see how your body's coping to these different physiologic stressors. On each set, we see this little dip in muscle oxygenation when you start load. Makes a lot of sense. You're using more oxygen at rest. And on the first few sets, you start to see either it starts increasing again a little bit or it kind of stays stable, which is great. It means you've reached a steady state at that intensity. But starting at about, I think that's the second set at 175 watts, you see after that initial drop, you have a progressive decline in muscle oxygenation. This tells us you're not at a steady state anymore. You've already pushed past that threshold. And then on each additional set, you see that slope of oxygenation getting more and more negative, meaning you're deoxygenating your muscles at a increasingly fast rate. Off the bat, like we don't need to worry about you having a oxygen utilization limitation because if someone has that limitation, the muscular system is limiting them. What you'll see is when they transition from a sustainable intensity to a unsustainable intensity, you really don't see that much of a difference in their oxygenation levels or the rate that their oxygenation changes. This is kind of that fixed gear athlete, the individual you say work to a 1 rep max back squat and you get a number, let's say 120 kilos, and then you say work to a 5 rep max back squat and you're like 120 kilos, work to a 10 rep max, 118 kilos. You're doing the same weight on every rep max. Or they run a mile, a 5K, and a 10K. It's effectively the same pace. That's going to be a good proxy that we have that utilization limited athlete. Now, for you, it's clearly an oxygen supply limitation. The question is it your pulmonary system or your cardiovascular system? This is where it gets a little bit difficult to parse that with just something like muscle oxygenation. So not to kind of plug NOXX's technology, but I think it is helpful to talk about some of these different measurements,
Of course.
and including things that NOXX does not measure to better understand. So if we think about the nitric oxide measurement, we've already eliminated that utilization limitation. I would be wanting to know two things. One, is it increasing set to set to set to set? If so, phenomenal. If not, where does it plateau? A lot of times what we see with these delivery limited athletes where the cardiovascular system is the rate limiting factor is that when someone gets up to say, let's say about 85% of their max heart rate is a rough proxy, you'll see that nitric oxide measurement just flatten out. Well, this is where let's start to think about why that might be. Well, if you release more nitric oxide and you dilate your blood vessels more, your cardiac output is going to have to increase for you to keep your blood pressure stable and avoid blacking out. If your cardiovascular system is the rate limiting factor, your brain is not going to let you continue to vasodilate up to a maximum intensity. Instead, you'll get the sympathetic nervous system vasoconstricting to prevent that increase in blood flow.
Yes.
So that's a really quick and easy way to say, well, is the cardiovascular system potentially a limiter, or is NO continuing to climb up to the point of failure, which might be a good sign that it's a respiratory limitation. Now, some other measurements that we might want to look at, one would be heart rate. A lot of times those people with the cardiovascular limitations, they might also see a plateau in heart rate prior to failure. So for you, it might have been at your second set at 225 watts, you might have seen heart rate not go up. even though you're deoxygenating the muscles more, and then at 275, it doesn't go up anymore.
Yeah.
With those respiratory limited athletes, you often again see it climbing up to the ends. Fourth measurement you could look at is blood oxygenation. This would be like a pulse oximeter on your finger. This is another interesting one to look at because in both the cardiovascular and the muscular limited athletes, you tend to not see these values change very much. You might see a 1, 2, maybe even a 3% change. In those respiratory limited athletes, particularly ones at a very elite level of performance, you might see their blood oxygenation drop by 10 to 15%.
That's
The
interesting.
reason why I say that is only a signature of someone at a elite level of performance. If you have like an intermediate level respiratory limited athlete, probably not going to see that, is because with elite endurance athletes, their cardiac output gets so high that their red blood cells move so quickly through their pulmonary capillaries that they don't have time to pick up oxygen. I kind of think of them like delivery trucks going through a factory. Imagine if the delivery trucks were speeding by and we're just like throwing packages into the back of the truck. We're probably going to miss a lot of those packages, and the truck is going to leave the factory half empty. Same concept. So that's why in elite endurance athletes, you see a lot of peripheral deoxygenation. Other things you can look at would be VO2. Specifically, I'm very interested in the ratio between their ventilatory exchange and their VO2. In a delivery or utilization limited athlete, again, that stays pretty stable. If someone is a very efficient breather, you're not going to see that change a lot. In that respiratory limited athlete, you'll see a very stable ventilatory exchange to VO2 ratio at low to moderate intensities. And you just see that increasing progressively at very high intensities, telling us that individual, either they're not coordinating their breathing well, or they know that they are not able to get enough gas exchange and they're, kind of panic breathing. Could also look at really simple things like spirometry, like a picometer or flow meter, where you're taking a maximal breath in and rapidly exhaling. With those, there's really three things that I want to look at, but the main reason why I would look at that would be to understand if someone is respiratory limited. Are they limited by their inspiratory muscles, their ability to take in oxygen, or their expiratory muscles, their ability to blow off CO2? So we can look at what's called their forced vital capacity. So if you were to take a maximal breath in and just blow all of your air out as hard as you can for 6 seconds, we want to know how much air in liters comes out in a 6-second period. And then we also have your FEV1, which is saying how much of that came out in that first 1 second. So there's age, sex norms for both of these numbers. I want to know, are these high or low for you? If both of these are low, but FEV1 is greater than, say, 75% of FVC6, it might mean that you have an inspiratory muscle limitation. If it's less than 75%, it might mean expiratory. Then the last thing that I would look at is just performance characteristics. You can learn a lot just by asking someone basic questions and even looking at their stats. For example, for you, just knowing a little bit more about your training background, I'd probably lean towards delivery limited. From what you've told me, you're someone that gains strength very easily. You probably have a very high top end speed or power, but maybe lack speed endurance. Probably excel at shorter workouts and distances. You probably get very pumped during exercises. Those are all kind of fingerprints of the delivery limited athlete. For the respiratory limited athlete, tend to be pretty balanced. One of the things that they do experience a lot is when they push to a maximum intensity, they'll get like tingling in their fingers or toes. You might even see their lips start to turn a little bit blue. They might get like visual spotting. So when I used to like race 5Ks competitively, I would see that. I would actually start to lose my vision towards the end of races. For the utilization limited athlete, that fixed gear individual we were talking about, a lot of times they just lack top end power, but they are very good at preserving high percentages of that max speed. So all these different limiters could be identified. And the reason why I like using technologies like NIRS is oftentimes people's perceptions are kind of unreliable. So you could start to parse these limiters and put like quantifiable metrics to them. And then you could actually train to improve these things and track the changes over time.
Yeah, this is absolutely key because also, just starting back to CrossFit, this is what you see all the time, right? People who train a substantial amount of hours, 5 to 6 workouts a week, right? Much more than me, for example. And you see them clearly plateauing. You see them, yeah, they come into the workouts, they just do the same and they don't really improve. And yes, it's a matter of efficiency, movement efficiency. There are plateaus, but also just like not really knowing how to train, like knowing how much rest to take in intervals, or just doing always workouts that last 8 to 12 minutes, and just always pushing to those limits and don't trying to improve the ceiling of these limits. And here, yeah, for example, this is what I see myself a lot, and that's why NIRS can be used, or your devices can be used, yes, in elite athletes, but the very cool part would obviously be to also get this more incorporated into maybe even workout classes, CrossFit classes, where the coach knows a little bit more than just doing 5x5 back squats.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's almost more important for the person who's very limited in the amount of time that they could train, because if you
Yes,
could only train 4 hours a week, don't you want to make sure that all 4 of those hours are going to be pushing you in ways that are going to help you improve your performance? Versus, particularly now that things like zone 2 are becoming so popular, I think one of the travesties is someone who has limited amounts of time to train. They keep hearing about the importance of zone 2, and they're like, well,
absolutely.
that's just what I'm going to do with my time that I need to train. That might not actually help that individual based on their own physiologic makeup. So now they've just completely switched the composition of their training to something that's just wholly ineffective for them. So I think it's really good to know these things, and it ultimately long term really makes training a lot simpler, because paralysis by analysis is a real thing with all the information out there. Um, it allows you to just kind of like cut through and realize, well, this type of training stresses the body in this way. Is that something that makes sense for me? If not, I don't need to worry about it, even though my favorite athlete is doing that, and it kind
Exactly.
of brings it down to the surface level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the training background definitely has a lot to do with that. Yeah, Evan, thank you. I think we're gonna wrap it up there. Your insights were super valuable and super interesting. How can people find you on the internet? How can people search you?
Yeah. First, thank you for having me on. That was a lot of fun. So yeah, the easiest way to find me would be just search first and last name on any social media platforms, Instagram, LinkedIn, Substack. That's where I do most of my writing. Then to learn more about NOXX, our website is just NNOXX.com. Same thing on social media. It's NOXX_Inc. INC, and you could find us on pretty much every social media platform.
Cool. Tell us 2 seconds a little bit more about your writing. You always write a newsletter on Substack, right? Like, where do you dig into, and which public is it for?
Yeah. So I have two separate publications.
Okay.
One of them is called On Human Performance, and that's really very geared towards the types of things that we're talking about today, identifying physiological limitations, performing testing, using technologies like the NOXX Wearable. So very geared towards that high performance audience, coaches, athletes, sports scientists. I also have a separate publication called Decoding Biology that's more bioinformatics and
Yes.
computational biology based. Sometimes that does kind of bleed into exercise science, but that's really more just molecular biology and things that are of personal interest.
All right. Thank you. I'm sure we'll have to repeat this, and maybe with some more case studies from athletes
Absolutely.
that we are working with. And yeah, looking forward to that.
Yeah, looking forward to that as well.